gentlemen, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. This evening, we're going to discuss the war in Vietnam and South Carolina's role in that war, both in pursuing the war and also opposition to the war as well. Of course, I am Dr. Robert Green II. I am actually broadcasting home. I'm a little under the weather this evening, unfortunately. My apologies. But I'm looking forward to tonight's class because it'll be led by two very special individuals, Becci Robbins and Bursey, who both offer some unique perspective on the Vietnam era and how this ties into what we've been discussing a great deal this semester in terms of a people's movement for change in South Carolina and beyond. I cannot also help but note the irony of the fact that we're doing this a week after Memorial Day. Last week, I actually took some time to go to Memorial Park in Columbia, South Carolina. There are quite a few monuments there. The biggest one is probably the Vietnam War Memorial at Memorial Park. If you've not been to it, it's a memorial that actually has the names of every South Carolinian who was killed in the Vietnam War. And it's a particularly sobering memorial, but I think as we'll talk about this evening, even with the plethora of monuments and memorials to the Vietnam War, most Americans today still don't quite understand what the war was about and why the opposition to that war was so outspoken during the conflict. So what I'd like to do now is next turn the floor over to Brett to give us a brief introduction, and then Becci lead the way in terms of talking about what opposition to the war in Vietnam looked like right here in South Carolina. Brett?
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it. I'm a Vietnam era veteran. I didn't fight in the trenches of Vietnam. I fought in the trenches of South Carolina, resisted the war because it made no sense to me, because I understood who we were fighting and why we were fighting them, and it was wrong. I had the great privilege and responsibility of being raised well in the military and living on Parris Island, the Marine Corps Recruit Depot from 1964 to 66, at a time when the Marine complement there was cranking up with young men about my age to go halfway around the world and kill people, and they had no idea why. And what I found out pretty early in the game was most of the people that were sending them didn't really understand why they were going to Vietnam to kill people. And I remember attempting to have a conversation with my commander father about, well, aren't we just attempting to help the French recolonize Vietnam? And isn't the colonization what we fought King George for? Dad had no appreciation for that analysis whatsoever. He had a government issue mentality. He was happy doing what the orders of the day told him to do. And we didn't agree on that much of anything, but he did always pay my bond and hire lawyers for me. But well, we don't want to just talk about Vietnam. Like most of the things we do in the Modjeska School, we find a significant piece of history and figure out what it's reflective of. How did the war in Vietnam, how does the war in Vietnam manifest America's practice of foreign policy? And it's ugly. That's not nice at all. And so the United States involvement in Vietnam goes back to World War II. And the Vietnamese people live in Vietnam. Well, the Vietnamese people haven't had control of Vietnam. The Chinese ran it for centuries. And then the French came in and beat the Chinese in the late 1890s. And so it was a French colony exporting manganese, rubber, everything else they could get out of Vietnam, and did nothing to help the development. And the French actually call their colonization a civilizing mission, because we call ours making something safe for democracy. And that in the run up to World War II, the Vietnamese people had, as most people do, indigenous people that are being occupied, they had been resisting. They resisted the Chinese, they resisted the French, and that the people that were resisting in the latter part of resisting the French was the Viet Minh, was what it was called. It's means something in Vietnamese that I don't quite know how to say. But Ho Chi Minh, who most of you are old enough to have heard Ho Chi Minh's name. Ho Chi Minh was an activist against the French. And he got in trouble when he had to leave France, and he worked as a longshoreman. He ended up in England and getting in touch with the socialist movement in England, went to school in Paris, and then went back to Vietnam when World War II started, because at that point, the Viet Minh who'd been fighting the French, who'd been fighting the Chinese, were then fighting the Japanese with the assistance of the Americans. And so all of a sudden, these people, the Viet Minh that were fighting the French, we were opposed to, because we supported the French colonization, are working with the Americans. So as we go through World War II, and World War II ends, 1945, there was a presumption on the part of the Vietnamese that it was going to be their country. The French were gone. They beat the Japanese back. The Chinese were gone. And Ho Chi Minh was elected to be the president of the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And he lifted the first two sentences out of our Declaration of Independence for the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. And he courted and looked for the United States support. I wanted to mention that this was not a new game for Ho Chi Minh. This was at the end of World War II. At the end of World War I, 1919, Ho Chi Minh presented a petition to the conference at Versailles, how do you say it? Versailles, to end French colonial occupation of Vietnam in 1919. Years passed, in 1945, he does the same thing in Geneva. And that they had the country for a little while, and then the French decided, we want it back. And the United States didn't want to like come right out and say, we're going to support you. So they just did what we do when we want to hide our hand. They gave them weapons and advisors. And the military advisory group, the military advisement assistance, MAG, M-A-A-G. If you ever watch MAG, the MAG group was the people on the ground in Korea that all those people in MASH were involved in. That was in '54. My father was MAG in Taiwan in 1954 to 1958, and I lived with him there. And so this is kind of the exploratory folks that aren't supposed to be doing the fighting. And so the MAG people were helping the French and just kind of dropped all pretext. And after 1954, when the French lost to the Vietnamese. And so now what are they going to do? And there was a settlement in Geneva to figure out how you do this now that the French have lost. And they drew this imaginary line on the 17th parallel of Vietnam and said, well, that's North Vietnam, that's South Vietnam. We have a way of doing that when we can't win. We just say, oh, these are our people here, and we appoint the, this guy's going to be the president.
Sounds familiar.
And the person they appointed to be the president, Mr. Diem, didn't last that long, but he was assassinated. By the CIA, organized an assassination with John F. Kennedy's approval, because Mr. Diem was not being aggressive enough in fighting the North Vietnamese for their own country. And so this, Becky's going to talk more about troops on the ground and boots on the ground in terms of the way the troop numbers ramped up, peaked, and then diminished. But that peaking, around about 1968, I think it was, in 1968, hundreds of troops are dying weekly. Those are American troops, excuse me. There were over 2 million Vietnamese dead by the end of the war. Close to 58,000 American boys whose names are on that monument in Washington.
You were talking about Dien Phu, is that the guy?
Dien Bien Phu was
Same guy?
when the French got kicked out.
Yeah.
And then we fast forward to the Tet Offensive in '72, which is when the tide turned. But before the tide turned, in terms of the resistance the opposition to the Vietnamese getting weaker and weaker and not having indigenous leadership by the. Do people know what the Vichy French were?
Yeah.
Okay,
We
the
do.
Vichy
The
Vietnamese
German
who worked for the Vichy French, and then the Vichy Vietnamese who worked for the American government. And so these were people that sold out their country.
Mm.
And he was assassinated by a CIA plot because he wasn't doing enough to get rid of the rest of his countrymen that were coming down from the north.
Welcome.
But Nixon, well, let me go back to President Johnson. And Dr. Green, Dr. Green, you there?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's there.
Do you want to play the clip that helped turn the tide in the war?
Oh, sure thing.
And so that in 1968, it's really rough. It's really rough. And there are a lot of people dying. And this guy comes on television and he says, well, go around.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
It's third down and 10 out of the shot.
Walter Cronkite was not a football game. Walter Cronkite visited Vietnam in January 1968. He gave that pitch in February 1968. In March 1968, LBJ said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the American people. I'm not running for president again. How that happened is part of what we want to explore and think about, because part of that happening was the immorality, the unjustness of the war. But if nobody noticed, if nobody complained, if a war is hosted and it's immoral and unjust, did it really happen? And I think that that's part of the problem, is this happens so often and so regularly with this type of disingenuous engagement, manipulation, and using other people. And we'll talk about lessons learned from Vietnam, lessons learned by the people that run wars, the people that make money off wars, the people that would suggest you invest your son in their war. If they don't lose. The military is the biggest budget we have. You may notice that it was one of the budgets that was off the table during this. We're going to go over the cliff. And so you build things that you hope you don't use, like bombs, and there's a hell of a lot of money in building weapons. They got airplanes out there that cost $1 billion now. And I have watched and read investigations about the way they get congressional engagement in supporting the war. You've got this Boeing's going to make, $500 billion off of building planes. And they get to go, well, Representative so-and-so, you can build a tail section in your district, and Representative so-and-so, you do the wheels over there. And they chop it up all over the country. Greasing everybody. Ain't right, folks. And so after Walter gave that
Although
speech,
in South Carolina. Sorry, I interrupted.
if you're going to convince, ma'am, speak up where the deaf guy can hear you.
I said Volvo in South
There
Carolina.
you go. But when LBJ said, I quit, Richard Nixon was running for president. And he said, well, he's going to end that war. And he won. He won the election. And he didn't end the war. And it went on, that was what, 68? That you saw Country Joe McDonald do the fish, we call it the fish.
Give me an F.
Sir?
Give me an F.
F,
Give me
Give me
an
an
I,
You.
S, H, that's the sanitized version. The fish
I'll go the other way.
But Country Joe did that at Woodstock in 68. In 69, I did that with 1 million people on the mall in Washington, D.C. after Nixon was elected.
wow.
I went from Columbia. We took a bunch of people up there. And it still resonates in my head to have 1 million people on the mall chanting, yelling at the top of their lungs, fuck. I mean, it was a great thing in America. And that Richard Nixon was reported as hiding, peeking out behind the curtain of the White House, which is right there. You can hear 1 million people being obscene to him. I think that's helped turn the tables, turn the war. But if one of the things that I've thought all along is if there aren't people in the street, things aren't bad enough. And I think that we've got, when they chop up your history, I can use the George Floyd protest as an example. The people that turned out all over the country in the streets raising hell, it wasn't a movement, it was a mob. They didn't have a strategy, they didn't have an organization, they didn't have a plan to follow up on. And that is what the people that run the bad game can count on if nobody knows what happened before them.
Yeah.
That's the point of the Modjeska School. That's the point of studying who came before us and what they tried to do and what some of them accomplished. And so in 1975, well, let's go back to 1970, because in May 1970, some things were happening all over the country. That May 1, Nixon, in his effort to end the war, decided he's going to like start bombing Cambodia and invade Cambodia. And that was like a bridge too far for people who had been protesting the war, bringing in a whole other country. And it precipitated protests at over 360 colleges and universities around the country. One of them was the University of South Carolina. And by May 4th, we had the killings at Kent State and Jackson State protesting. And that week we had the problems at the problems. No, the righteous anger at the university overflowing. And we've got some clips that help put that in perspective in terms of who the status quo in South Carolina was supporting. But in 1970 at the university, there were probably about 600 people arrested. And we're going to talk about that after Becci brings us into something that she has spent, the book that she did, the
You're supposed to have it out there.
I gotta wave it around so people in Zoom land can see it. The book that Becci just finished not long ago starts with the 1965 engagement of the anti-war military people here in Columbia, South Carolina. And there's way too many people that don't know about the centrality of the efforts that came in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s out of South Carolina. And so I'm going to wrap that up and just say that in 1975, Saigon fell and the United States left, and they were several decades late in leaving. So, Dr. Green, you want to take questions now, and we'll see if there's any questions about the lead up to what Becci's going to talk about with the next segment. Y'all got any questions?
Any questions at all?
Did they have,
Jane, speak up.
did they have a national database for which to get kids to send to the war, or did they just pick out very different areas, like Republican areas where war is okay, and send those kids off to war?
They had a draft,
Right?
Yeah.
Your draft.
Was
Yeah,
it
they did a
national?
lottery.
It was a lottery, but it was a national draft, wasn't it?
Yeah, then we'll get into that more in the segment that Becci's going to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I was called up 3 times. And by the time they didn't call me that last time because I was saying, give me a gun, and they
Well, and to the point about the draft, it is worth noting that as early as 1966, members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, noticed that they were receiving a lot of draft notices if they were in SNCC or other Black organizations early on in the war. And even though it was a national draft, what you had was a situation where some of the draft boards were much more aggressive in drafting people of color, especially African Americans, also poor whites, and so forth. Something that I know Becci and Britt will talk about a bit more. But yet, while there was a national draft, the draft disproportionately impacted people who basically had no choice but to go. I see Randall's hand is also up too. Randall, go ahead, please.
You just, Brett very briefly mentioned Kent State, and simultaneously within a couple of days, if not sooner, the Jackson State killings in Jackson, Mississippi. Yeah, Mississippi. And I got to tell you, Dr. Green, when you were doing the Orangeburg massacre several weeks ago, I couldn't help but make that connection in my mind about the parallels between Kent State, Jackson State, and Orangeburg. And I still think that it's a major big deal in terms of the parallels of history. That's all.
Right. That's a good point. That's a really good point. All right. And Keith, go ahead, please.
Okay, having been there, done that, got the scars. Yeah, the lottery was universal, but I think the economic factor that you kind of touched on, those of us who could afford to go to college had deferments.
Right.
Big difference. That's all I wanted to point out.
Here.
Exactly. That's a great point. So I think on that note, I'd like to turn the floor over to Becci so she can really delve a bit deeper into a piece of history of the Vietnam War that should frankly be much better known. So Becci, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I find this subject matter really, really fascinating, and it's infuriating to understand how little I knew about it until I worked on that book that Brett referenced earlier. And the more I dig into it, the more, like an onion, the more fascinating it is to me. And so I'm really excited to get into some of that tonight. First of all, I just want to say I dressed for the occasion. I was born on a military base in Zaragoza, Spain, and it was young airmen who lined up in the hospital to donate blood when I had complications as an infant. And my mother and father worked for on the military bases. My dad taught schools. My mom worked in the dental clinic. We were civilians, but I went to schools on military bases. I went to high school on military bases. I lived with a paratrooper for 10 years. I got this T-shirt when I was 19 for being one of 2 civilians to train with the 509th in Italy. And I jumped out of a helicopter with a chute that I packed myself. So I tell you all this, A, to claim my status as a badass. And number 2 is that I think that what I say tonight might be misconstrued as being anti-military, because I am not anti-military at all. I have a deep affection for the military. I understand the culture pretty intimately. And so I just want to put that out there before I take it to task. There's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who said something to the, I hope I don't butcher it, but it's something to the effect that wars are waged twice, first on the battlefield and second in memory. And I think when it comes to the Vietnam War, we've buried that memory, and what's left of it has been so repackaged and rebranded, it's hardly recognizable. And to me, the tragedy is that we've really missed the opportunity to learn something as a nation about, to learn something from that massive human uprising in this country to oppose the war, which was a very courageous thing to do, obviously. So I want to just say that I learned a lot in that book. So I will just kind of give the cliff notes on that, because there's no point in reading to rehash all of the details that are in the book. And I hope you will look at it if you haven't already. So Robert, would you just please play the first couple videos, and then we can talk about it from there.
Will do. And while I pull up those videos, as I noted in the chat, I can't help but note the irony that myself, Becky, and Brett all come from military families. So, because I was also born a military base, albeit in Germany. So here is the first video. We'll watch a couple of minutes of this. This is from 1965. It's called War Within a War. It is a film from the United States Marine Corps.
This village was a battlefield in the Republic of Vietnam. Until recently, its people lived under the domination of communist guerrillas. Vietnamese forces, assisted by United States Marines, drove out the guerrillas with force of arms, but not without loss of Vietnamese and American lives. This particular battle, in this particular war, was won, in the sense that this piece of ground is again controlled by friendly forces. In another sense, the battle for this village has just begun. For in the final victory, it will not be who holds the ground, but who holds the allegiance of the people that win this war. These are the real victims of war: the farmer, the fisherman. For them, the war is a nightmare that never ends. And the faces of the people reflect this suffering. From these villages, the Viet Cong impressed the young men into service, confiscated the rice crops and medical supplies, leaving hunger and disease as payment. But today, peace and security are no longer empty communist promises, but guarantees from the latest entries in the war, the United States Marine Corps. These newcomers are destroying the myth that communist Viet Cong cannot be defeated on the field of battle. And on yet another battlefield, these same Americans are fighting for the trust and confidence of a people caught up in a war within a war. For the tortured people of this tortured land, the first American friendship comes in a can of rations, in the outstretched hand of a big friendly Marine. The wars have traditionally produced scarred, naked children and friendly Marines. In this humane battle for survival, there is little time for rest. Our friendship and help is available now. Friendship that comes in a bottle. Pills that are needed now. As are the other miracles of modern medicine from a friendly nation. Friendship comes in the sensitive hands of the Navy doctor, who with native translators treat pneumonia with modern techniques instead of herbs on the victim's chest. For the Vietnamese peasant, this foreign doctor, with his bag full of strange-looking medicines.
Okay, so I think that's
No.
get the point there.
That's enough,
I
yeah.
think that kind of shows you how the Americans are presenting the war in 1965. But again, as Becky mentioned, there is a local connection to this, and here's where a good friend of ours enters the fray when it comes to the Vietnam War, and specifically protest against the war.
The several disobedience campaigns the United States involvement in Vietnam, which erupted on the weekend
Got a good day.
in the most massive demonstrations to date, mark a sharp new success for the communists. It gives a clear signal that the communists are operating again through the popular front tactic which they first displayed in the United States in the early 1930s. The degree to which communists now operate in the open is evident from the remarks of Gus Hall, Secretary of the Communist Party USA, who recently bragged, and I quote, "Fronts are a thing of the past. We don't need them. We've got the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Students for a Democratic Society going for us. But they are not fronts of the usual sense of the word. They are just a part of the responsible left, that portion of American youth that realizes American society is sick," end quote. Rigid enforcement of the laws can stem this tide, and it should be demanded by every responsible American.
Okay, so that's our good friend Strom Thurmond talking about his concerns about the anti-war movement. And I will note that the Thurmond video we just watched, that actually comes from the year 1965. So you already can see that there is a growing anti-war movement as soon as the U.S. gets heavily involved in the war. And also we'll make sure to send those links out to the video later on as well. So Becky, once again, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think those, yeah, that Marine video kind of blew my mind. It just goes on forever, and they give dollies out to little girls, and it's just really over the top. And those are the kind of videos that a young doctor that was living in New York was probably exposed to. He wasn't a Marine, but so 1965 is the year those videos came out, were the same year that a young Captain Howard Levy landed in Colombia to head up the dermatology clinic at Fort Jackson. And he had been part of the Berry Plan, which allowed people, students, to defer service until they finished their schooling. And so once he'd gotten his degree, it was time to make good on his arrangement. And so he found himself at Fort Jackson to train troops headed to Vietnam. And by the time that he got there, he'd already been going to meetings and teach-ins and sit-ins, and was quite anti-war when he hit the ground in Colombia. And so it was a really bad fit from the beginning, and he kind of rubbed the brass wrong from day one. He didn't want to live in officers' quarters. He decided to live in a Black neighborhood. He helped do voter registration education in rural Newberry County. He started the Carolina Contract newsletter that we talked about that Jim Felder worked on. He started that. So he was doing all this kind of work off campus when he was off duty. And he was a really chatty guy and would talk a lot about what his opinions were about the war, both on and off post. And it caused a lot of raised eyebrows and ruffled feathers on the fort, and they started keeping tabs on him, started watching his every move. And when he decided that he wasn't going to be a party to training the guys going to Vietnam, because he called it medical prostitution, because by day they were, as you saw in the video, they were trying to curry favor with villagers and make the troops palatable to the Vietnamese civilians. And by day they were doing that, and by night they were bombing those same villages, and he didn't want to be a part of that. So he refused to train him. At first, his commanding officer said that he was just going to kind of reprimand him. But after he was given a dossier of all the information that they'd been tracking him, he was labeled a commie pinko. So they decided to they gave him an ultimatum: you quit, you either train the trainees or face the consequences. He said he chose the latter. And so they arrested him, and it became this international trial. And he was the first one within the military to question the limits of free speech and soldier ability to, not just be a conscientious objector, but to really within the military to already in service to be opposing the war. Robert, could you play that clip of him getting arrested? The trial was a circus. And it ended up, this is him going into the trial and exiting.
who are you taking orders from? I want to talk to him. May I talk to your superior? Can you say any legal? Here we're talking about a man sentenced for essentially his opinions and beliefs in a case that involves words in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, who is taken away in handcuffs to the stockade in a rough manner, and in that way, this case ends for the time being. I don't know of a parallel in this country with that procedure.
That was Levi's lawyer, Charles Morgan Jr., who was quite the celebrity himself. He was the ACLU lawyer out of Atlanta, who also represented Julian Bond and Muhammad Ali in their anti-war cases. So he was pretty high profile. So he took on Levy's case, and you saw him there fighting with the mute cops, and we can talk about that later. But that was only the beginning of the problems at Fort Jackson. The brass probably thought they had a free ride once that Levy was behind bars and that they'd set the example, but that was really the beginning of their troubles at Fort Jackson. The next year, or just a few months later, they did a pray-in at Fort Jackson. A couple dozen GIs who were anti-war decided to test the limits of what they could get away with on the fort. So they held a pray-in at outside the chapel, and the cops got wind of it, told them to disperse. Most of them did, but 5 of them kind of lingered, and 2 of them dropped to their knees. The MPs told them to quit praying, and they got hauled off to the stockade and were facing court-martial charges. It wasn't a really good look for the Army to tell people to get off their knees and quit praying. So it was kind of a bad look for the Army and a public relations nightmare. And it was one of the first organizing events that was co-organized by civilians at the newly opened UFO Coffeehouse in Columbia, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so they were hauled off to jail. It made national news. And Charles, that same lawyer, took the case. Charles Morgan took the case. It made it in the national press and became quite an embarrassment. They tried to have a second pray-in, but the cops just shut down the base completely to try to keep reporters from coming in, which just made it all the worse. So they ended up dropping charges for the pray-in guys. At the same time, there were people coming into the Army who were already radicalized, mostly young socialists from the Young Socialist Alliance. And one of them was Joe Miles, who was from DC, and he came to Columbia. He got his draft notice, said that I'm really anti-war, I'm not sure you want me. They drafted him anyway. He shows up in Columbia and finds, to his surprise, that there's already an anti-war movement kind of coalescing on the ground there in Columbia, much unexpectedly, by a handful of guys who are meeting and talking about their feelings and getting a sense of the buzz that's happening around the country, and starting to question their participation in this war that they are pretty convinced at this point is unjust. And Joe Miles starts playing Malcolm X tapes for them and talking about making the linkages between, what we're doing in Vietnam and how Black people are being victimized in this country. And they start connecting the dots. And knowledge is power, as we always say, and it's more than just a cliche. It was kind of evident and happening then on that on the fort. And so they start meeting informally, just mostly Black guys and a couple of Puerto Ricans. They start getting real serious real quickly. They start meeting 4 or 5 times a week. They decide to formalize the organization. They call it GIs United Against the War in Vietnam. It's the first such organization anywhere. And they start, the brass gets wind of it and thinks it smells a little dangerous to them. So they create new regulations saying that that they cannot hold gatherings of more than 8 people because of risk to respiratory disease. And they decide to get around that new regulation, they decide to meet outdoors even in January. So they're having one of these big sessions. There's, like 100 people, both outside between these barracks and hanging out the windows, listening to these people talk about the war. And they decide that the Browse is really quite upset at this point that they're still meeting and getting around the rules. And they charge 8 of the ringleaders, as they call them. Actually, they charge 9 of them with, I don't remember what the actual charges were, but they arrest these 9 people. And this becomes yet another big international embarrassment for the Army and the fort. To cut to the chase, they have they do petition gathering on the post. They try to present these petitions to the base commander, and it's refused on the basis that it's collective bargaining. So it really further inflames all the people that risk signing their names on these petitions and getting backlash. In the meantime, as these petitioners and these people that are organizing are trying to get their word out on, all they're asking for is a place to meet and raise questions, to have a discussion about the war and their role in it. And so they're just taking it as a free speech matter at this point. The petitions, like I said, are rejected, and it inflames the trainees on camp, on the fort, even more. So, and it also gets more international press. When they finally go to trial, it turns out that one of the 9 arrested was a spy, and he was sitting in on their conversations with their lawyer, which, we'll hear more about that. Brett knows a little something about that, and he can talk about that later on a personal level. All that is to say that it looked real. The trial was a fiasco, so they ended up dropping the charges. So the Army wasn't scoring very high on this one, but in the meantime, there was all this organizing going on that included them creating something that I think is really near and dear to my heart, which was the Short Times, a GI newspaper, resistance newspaper. It was one of the first of its kind, and it was the longest running that came out of Fort Jackson. It started as this little mimeographed newsletter thing that grew into kind of I wouldn't say sophisticated, but it certainly was formalized and had a distribution of 5,000 by the time it was said and done. And it became, it was really important. I think back in the days when that was the only way people could really communicate. There was no internet, no cell phones, et cetera, no web that they could communicate. So these newspapers were really vital for sharing information, getting information about if you wanted CO counseling, that kind of thing, information about people that upcoming events, et cetera. And there's a repository in Wisconsin. I'll send a link out later. So that's kind of where that has some, I think there are like 900 some newspapers of that kind in that era, in about an 8-year time span, and they're just really interesting to look at because it's very visceral, very raw, by the guys in the field facing all the risks and doing all the killing, all the dying. So to segue, when the things happened on campus, I keep calling it a campus, on the fort, at the same time the UFO was the coffee house was starting on Main Street, and a guy named Fred Gardner came from San Francisco to open up what he had a new concept about creating alliances between students and soldiers and draft resistors and people doing CO counseling, that they could collaborate in new ways to kind of oppose the war. So he opened up a coffee house in Fort Jackson. He himself was an Army reservist, and he had spent time at Fort Jackson, had done training at Fort Jackson. So he had, he knew what he was talking about. He's Harvard educated, was writing for the Scientific American. And he showed up and opened up the UFO Coffeehouse right across from the city hall in Columbia. And it became immediately a thorn in the side of the city elders, and it took them, so they infiltrated the place, tried to shut it down every which way they could. They were tracking the people that set the thing up, the people that were working the place, the civilians. Robert, this may be a time to show the video clip of Fred Gardner, the guy who came from San Francisco, talks about, it's a brief clip talking about why he chose this and why it became a model.
Well, from my own experience in the service, I felt that it was important that GIs have a hangout, a place they could gather in a non-military atmosphere and discuss the things that were really on their mind.
Did you sell any alcoholic beverages there?
No, we didn't. It was a coffee house.
Did you have any trouble with drug pushers or users?
No.
On occasion, they tried to operate out of the UFO. We expelled them, and we made an offer to the police, we wouldn't finger anybody, but if they would supply us with names and pictures of people they knew to be pushers, we would talk to them at the door and try and keep them out on, using our own methods.
Did you form it basically because you're opposed to the war in Vietnam and wish to influence soldiers?
For both moral and tactical grounds, I never tried to influence soldiers. I always had the feeling that if and when men got a sense of their true numbers and realized how many hundreds, how many thousands of them were choking with shame and angry and unwilling to go to Vietnam, they would find ways of expressing their own feelings.
So, as a place for a GI to hang out.
What's wrong with Bob Hope and Martha Ray and ping pong? Nothing. It's just that people, want. There's another culture in this country.
So, yeah, that's kind of the reception that they got from the powers that be and the mainstream press in Colombia. But the coffee house was wildly successful, so much so that Fred Gardner himself left after a couple months to open up a couple more in Texas and in Washington. And shortly thereafter, they were springing up all across the country near military installations and overseas as well. And so they became this really important tool, a new organizing model. And I think it's really important for us to remember that that happened right here in South Carolina, and the importance of that, I think, does not get that people don't get the credit that they deserve for having done really important work for just in those 2 brief years. And the UFO was shut down eventually. Like I said, they were infiltrating, there were cops coming in, and they were tracking people. It was really quite invasive and untoward, to be quite honest. And to read the FBI files on them is just frankly chilling. But they soldiered on and did really important organizing work in conjunction with the folks at Fort Jackson. But when they were finally shut down in 1970 after 2 years for being a public nuisance, and they arrested 5 of the operatives. One of them managed to evade the authorities, and one of them, they dropped charges because she was, by the time they went to trial in April, she would have been like 8 months pregnant, and they thought it wasn't a really good look. So they dropped the charges, but they charged them that when they went to trial, the jury was out for a very short time, no more than a couple of hours, and they came back charging them with more than what the prosecutor even asked for. We copped a deal, and they left the state, and they were kind of just run out of South Carolina, which was kind of the story happens again at USC, which Brett will get into, which is how the best and the brightest are kind of run out of the state, which is a thing that I think that we're still kind of trying to recover from, quite frankly, in terms of grassroots organizing. I'm going a little long, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
No, you're not sorry. It's okay.
Let's put off on the left there. Peter stuff, because he's from Blackville, South Carolina. He was born in South Carolina. UFO was directly across the street from the Columbia City.
Okay, so there's that video, and Becky, you also wanted us to see the actual trial video. Is that right?
Yeah, there's just a short video of them exiting the van, and
Okay.
then just so you can get a good look at them.
Okay, gotcha. All right. See.
And then Will's comments on the trial are very good too. It's only a minute 30.
Right.
Jay Hay, he was an FBI informer who turned out to be a good friend.
That guy?
And that's Dwayne Frey on the right, Lenny Cohen in the middle, and Will Balk on the left. Dwayne was had already served time in Leavenworth. He was a lieutenant in the Air Force.
And then finally, let's look
Let
at.
me just, Brett,
Oh, go ahead.
when he was serving in Leavenworth, he shared a cell with Howard Levy, just as a small world aside.
Wow.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, and this is the video of the comments on the actual trial itself from William Balk. So let's take a look at this.
I have serious doubts about whether I'll be able to respect, as Judge Agnew commended all three of us, respect law and order. We were commended, as we were brought before the bench, we were commended for having behaved ourselves well in the courtroom. It was with a great deal of naivete that I went into that courtroom. I really did respect the courts. I did have hopes. I did think that justice would be served. I did think that people would be able to see the facts and be able to judge fairly. I did think that the solicitor and the judge, even with their prejudices, would be able to act fairly and according to law. That's impossible for me to believe now. There is no way for anyone to convince me that the court that I sat in was a fair judicial situation. There's no way for me to believe that that served law and order.
In other words, you don't think that you received a fair trial?
I believe that under the system, that probably was a fair trial.
Wow, that is something.
Wow.
Yeah, so I just think that the way his heart was broken, I think a lot of people's were along with him, not just about the war, but just how all of the institutions seem to be failing. You know, all the things that we once believed in were kind of failing. But before I turn it over to what happened, this trial really ignited stuff on that was all this, the unrest that was already happening at the University of South Carolina. And I'm going to turn it over to Brett because he was in the middle of that and had a front row seat, and not even a seat. Anyway, he had a major role in all of that. So I'll turn it over to him. But before I do, I just wanted to put a bow on my part of it by saying that I went to the South Carolina exhibit near the State Museum last week. It's called South Carolina in Vietnam. It's a new exhibit, and it's part of it's in the Confederate Relic Room and South Carolina War Memorial Museum.
Yeah.
It's kind of unwieldy title. The last time I'd been to the Confederate Relic Room, it was off the USC campus, and it was like 20 years ago, and it was 5 rooms with some dusty uniforms on really bad mannequins, and it was run by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and it was really a sad little thing. It was while we were fighting the endless war against the Confederate flag on the thing, so I went to go educate myself at the Confederate Relic Room. And so I was really quite surprised to come see the new, it moved to next door to the State Museum between the Adventure and the State Museum, and it covers all the wars now. And the Daughters of the Confederacy bequeathed their collection to the museum, but with conditions that they get to keep a seat on the board. And so when I went to the exhibit, to kind of connect dots here, it was quite well done. It was slick presentations, well presented. The displays were quite compelling. There was they had interactive kiosks where you could pick up and hear actual clips of interviews and things like that. So I really recommend people to go see it. Unfortunately, the narrative is really lacking. And there's not a single peep about not a single thing that I've talked about tonight or that anybody's talked about tonight is reflected in that exhibit at all. And so I was kind of disappointed about that. And I called the curator of the thing, got the curator's name and number, and called him next day and had a nice long chat with him. And he turned out to be quite candid with me about why there was no war stuff, anti-war material in there, even though South Carolina played a leading role in that. And I think it's something that we should frankly be proud of. We talk about, there's a panel in the exhibit that talks about how South Carolina is proudly, defies a federal authority. It says so right there in the exhibit. And yet there's, they have a problem with having this stuff. And so anyway, I had a long chat with this guy, and he admitted that the project had started before the pandemic. They were trying to marry it with the 50th anniversary of the war. And so and when it started, they had Fritz Hammer, some of you may know him, who's a longtime curator at the State Museum, and frankly, anti-war. And he was putting together a Vietnam exhibit. The pandemic put everything on hold. In the meantime, he retired, and the new guy came in and took over this exhibit and the writing of the narrative. And it turns out that this guy's really had pushed for, Ben Batiste is the curator now, and he had pushed for having the inclusion of that anti-war material. He knew about the Fort Jackson 8. He knew about the Pray-In. He knew about Howard Levy. He knew all of that. And he pushed, or at least he said that stuff had been in there, and that because of political pressure and what he called the purse strings, how the purse strings work, that stuff was pulled. And I want to know more about that. And I also want to challenge that notion that, his point was that they didn't want to offend any of the veterans that might be coming to visit. And I made the point, and he agreed, that some of those veterans are also anti-war. And so you can't have it both ways. And I think that it's worth taking this whole notion. The exhibit's going to be up for many more months, and I would like to figure out a way to kind of challenge that, whether we have our own forum or whether we do something just setting up a table outside the exhibit. I don't know. I'm really feeling like they need to hear some pushback on the choices that they've made, because it's still it's ironic that the Daughters of the Confederacy are still calling the shots here in Columbia, South Carolina in 2023. And I think that's tragic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brett, and I'll take questions at the end of the thing. So I hope we still have time for questions. Brett?
Becci, I want you to know Tom Thurman will be very proud that the Confederate Daughters of the Confederacy is still holding court. Becci spent close to 2 years work doing the research on that book, which everybody has to read because there's a lot more substance to it than we were able to touch on. I want to go back to a couple things that she mentioned during the UFO trial. They were charged with keeping and maintaining a public nuisance, and they were sentenced to 5 years in prison. No one had ever served time for that, and the only people that had ever been arrested in Colombia for keeping and maintaining a public nuisance ran a brothel, and they didn't go to jail. And so that idea of charging people and then dropping the charges if they leave the state is what they do to white people they don't like.
Yeah.
Black people, they just shoot. And that's a fact. I'm sorry, that's true. And we need to lift that up. And I probably would be one of the shot ones if I wasn't a white middle class guy that was just cute and smart. And that I had the opportunity to have a number of instances in working with the short times and the GIs against the war. I recall one really unfortunate scene at Fort Jackson when I went to get somebody that wanted to leave, and being literally, guy came over the desk after me and literally being run off the base because I was helping people leave the military, go AWL, escape, go to Canada. And then I had a visit from a lieutenant in a green car that said, you know, U.S. Army. And he read a proclamation that was something like, "Know ye by all men's presence that you have been found guilty of being inimical to the conduct and morale of the men of Fort Jackson, and you are hereby prohibited from entering the fort under penalty of blah, blah, woof, woof." And so I was banned, and those banning orders went out to people that were helping the GIs do and that were organizing. And all of us were so penetrated. The defense camps were penetrated by agents, and our buildings were penetrated by listening devices. And I actually thought I was popular at the time, but most of my friends were paid to be my friends. And so we'll talk about my travails at another time. But I did want to mention some of the other stuff about the UFO being right directly across the street from City Hall, literally right across from City Hall. So it was kind of like a finger in the eye of the status quo. And that had Phil Oakes played there. Drake Small played there. And Drake Small was a local blues doctor that he's on his waning days now of what, this 50 years later. Drake looks about like he did then. But they had really provocative entertainment, a really calm atmosphere. And it was the UFO was a play on the USO, and it was the first, as Becci pointed out, the first coffee house that was started. Was a lot of Quaker money involved, the American Friends Service Committee, and that after Fred Garner got this one going, there were a number started around the country, and that is something that I think we want to try and model with the work that we're doing with the Modjeska School. Because we are the only example I know of a deep dive into state history. That Howard Zinn wrote a book in 1968 that was a Bible for everyone that organizes, and you should get a copy of it, called The People's History of the United States. And so the history is not written by the people that make the history. It's written by the people that tell the history in order to preserve their standing and to maintain the status quo that preserves their standing and their financial well-being. And so the work that we're doing here with the Modjeska School is the only one I know of that's doing a school, a Zen-like school, that's focusing on where your feet touch the ground. What do you need to know about South Carolina's history in order to be able to provide effective citizenship to resist the things that are contrary to that which it is we believe? So I have been delegated to talk.
Who wrote that?
Yes.
Who wrote the People's History?
Howard Zinn?
Zinn?
Howard Zinn, Z-I-N. And Zinn was a political scientist who was left of liberal. And he actually spoke at the University of '69 at something that we put on. And he died just a year or two ago. And the Zinn Project is a foundation that he was alive when it started, and it's carried on, and it is doing wonderful work. I would suggest everyone go to the Zen Project get on their mailing list, because they send out exactly the type of stuff that we're doing that is relevant to what we're doing. We worked with them when we started the school in 2014, and they're very excited about our mode of operation. And I participated in a couple of things that they've done. And they also are partners with a group called Teaching for Change, which has been providing teachers around the country that are being told they can't teach the truth, free copies of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And so those are two really good groups. If you're a teacher, they provide lesson plans that are really specific for different age groups that are free. And so we hope to be able to see the Modjeska School get some of our graduates to be tuning into this. We've got some teachers that have signed up for this year's course that we hope we can see getting a youth division of the Modjeska School started and being able to take that to schools. Any questions about the UFO, the Fort Jackson 8?
Does youth refer to people less than 60 years old?
What's 2 years old?
Does youth refer to people under 60 years old?
I can't hear you, Stephen.
Does youth refer to people under 60 years old?
59.
Speak low. Sorry, I had to scream.
No problem. I'm deaf even with my hearing aids. And so the so let's move on. Howard.
Well, Randall has a question.
Yes, sir.
In this, I think that's me. My fire alarm's going off. I'll table my question. My house.
All right, Randall. Well, I know you'll be back.
Did the lecture do that? Set it on fire.
And I wanted to add a couple things that I skipped over that I think are really significant in talking about the kind of the way that America practices foreign policy, and that there's this trail of tragedies behind us. The Monroe Doctrine was the business about how President Monroe in the early 1800s warned other countries that, y'all, this is our backyard, this being the Caribbean, Central America, Latin America, South America, the Western Hemisphere. But it wasn't until like the late 1800s that they started exercising that. But what we've seen and what we're experiencing now is results of us supporting dictatorial regimes in Nicaragua and Haiti and all of that, where then in the 60s, late 60s, there were a lot of revolutions where people got thrown out. The bad people got thrown out. And the American government, Cuba is a unique example. In the 1959, the Cuban people rose up and threw out this gangster, Batista. And it was like 80% illiteracy, 85% illiteracy, no doctors. And Cuba, in short order, had a higher literacy rate than South Carolina, a lower infant mortality rate than South Carolina, because they invested in the people. And we've been trying to smash that regime ever since it started in 1959. And it's like our way or you die. And that we try and wrap that up in all kinds of different packages. But it's the type of thing that has been practiced to the degree that chicken has been coming home to roost for a long time. That we jobbed out. There's this term in the lefty land called the international proletariat. And Marx, who was a brilliant economist, he talks about there being working class people and people that didn't work but lived on the money they had. There's a term, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. That's it. What was this middle class? What's this middle class thing? Well, you see, that's this fantasy land that the bourgeoisie, the people with the money, made to keep the people in the proletariat from rebelling. And so in America, we've always had the white people. We all can be poor, but you too can be rich someday.
If you don't get woke.
just work hard and you'll get ahead and prosper. This is a land of opportunity. Don't strike, don't join a union, etc. We're going to pay you very little, but you are better off than those black people that can't come in the front door. And so that playing off of people against each other is embedded in the type of predatory economy that we have. There really needs to be poor people. They work cheap. And so we've got these systemic problems that this critical race theory that people are upset about, that's simply an analysis and reflection of the critical problems that are woven into the system on purpose.
Yeah.
It's not an accident. Somebody's getting rich and laughing all the way to the bank every time they make a bomb. So we got a lot of work to do, folks. But I had to share that before I talked about the young people, the young idealistic people like myself getting involved in I got involved in the civil rights movement before I got involved in the anti-war movement. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, that segue. I spoke about growing up in the military and being convinced that Vietnam was a bad idea by the time I was graduating from high school. I went to University of Georgia for a year. That was 1966. And a racist restaurateur named Lester Maddox was elected governor. And nobody thought Lester was going to win. He was a cartoon.
Much like Trump.
He ran against this guy named Bo Calloway, who was former Secretary of the Navy, traditional white Southern, liberal. And at one of the debates, somebody challenged him for not having graduated from high school. He literally held up a matchbook. And in those of you that are old enough to remember, the matchbooks had these little things you could send for a certificate to high school.
Both of us.
Yeah. And there had been a riot at the state prison. And people were talking about, well, what do we do? And Lester's suggestion was, we need a better class of prisoners, which everyone agreed with. But Lester won the governor's race in November 1966, and that was my first actual protest. And I marched with a group called the Southern Student Organizing Committee. And SSOC was formed when the white people left SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1964. So that was just 2 years after the white people left SNCC, with the understanding that the white people didn't need to go into the Deep South and explain to black people that were oppressed. The white people needed to go to white colleges where the problem was. Made a lot of sense to me. Fast forward, I end up at the University of South Carolina in 1968. And that was a hell of a year. Dr. King was killed. There were Jeeps with 50 caliber machine guns with from Fort Jackson riding around Columbia. And we're not going to tolerate any of that stuff they do in them Yankee cities. And then Robert Kennedy was killed, and Robert said something that still rings true. Those who prevent peaceful change make violent revolution inevitable. It seems to be a road to hell that we're bound to follow. And in 1968 was the Democratic Convention in Chicago that some of you may have watched on television. I was heartbroken I didn't get to go, but it really was a year that a lot of people like myself decided that there has to be a different path for us than we were raised to believe existed in this country. And I became an outlaw. I was not going to participate in their war. And I signed up, I was SOC staff, Southern Student Organizing Committee staff paid. I think it was $15 a week. And I had they bought a used van for me to drive. It was from the Bell Telephone Company. It was a screen van with racks on top. You could park it anywhere. You park on sidewalks and stuff. It was great to pick up a used phone company van if you want to park anywhere. And so the Southern Student Organizing Committee was a chapter I started at USC. There was a group that existed called AWARE, A-W-A-R-E. It was not an acronym. It was a lefty group that was there for 2 years before I came. And when I came, the people that had been doing it were gone. And they had not been very demonstrative in their criticisms. It was just a weekly meeting or bi-weekly meeting. And so by 68, things were ratcheting up considerably. And the climate was getting a whole lot hotter, both on the side of the people that were opposed to American policy and the people that didn't like people that were opposed to American policy. And the things that happened at the university were essentially controlled by people that didn't like what we were doing. And we got in trouble, we being the AWARE group, we get in trouble for posting flyers that weren't stamped as official. or for moving a table and a chair to have a meeting. And so those were big time crimes. They couldn't say, we don't want you talking about this. We don't want to censor your, your actions. So they used petty things. But the first thing that we did, I think, that really gained attention, and I think, Robert, you have that picture of the gamecock with the white problem gamecock from February 69.
Let me share that.
Put that up on the screen. But this is the idea in February 69. It was the anniversary of the Orangeburg Massacre, February 8th, 1968, which most of us that were there in 69 were aware of what happened in Orangeburg. And so we had what was going to be a Black Awareness Week, but changed the name of it to the White Awareness Week. Remember when the white people left SNCC?
Yeah.
This is what I learned from them. That it's not a black problem. It's a freaking white problem. And so we had a White Awareness Week, and we had some incredible people. And I'm humbled when I go back and learn who it was I was working with. James McBride Dabbs was one of the few white, wealthy, gentle people in South Carolina with a plantation that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was opposed to Jim Crow. And he was somebody that came, somebody who was a famous union organizer from North Carolina came. And so we did this seminar on white awareness for a week in the Russell House. And at the end of the seminar, we demanded the university quit using Dixie as a fight song and flying the flag. The top right-hand side of that page, Robert, has something about the Dixie controversy. But when the football teams and the basketball teams went out to their field to play, they played Dixie and waved Confederate flags. And Tom Jones, the liberal guy that was running the university and working with the cops, you can trust the liberal to grease the knife they use to cut your throat. Write that down, kids. Write that down. So anyway, Tom Jones was a very nice guy. And he agreed with us. He agreed with us. He said, "Oh, we should quit playing Dixie and not use the Confederate flag." And we were all empowered, and we marched up to the State House to demand they take the flag down off the top of the dome. This was what, 69, so it had been up there since 61. And it was the first time I realized there were no black elected officials in the building. 170 legislators, 9 constitutional officers, all white. Let's see, Civil Rights Act passed, Voting Rights Act passed. That's not working very well, is it? I mean, the only black people were the people, tending the flowers and emptying the garbage cans. And so we went back to the university, and some people burned the Confederate flag right on the horseshoe. And I think that article quotes me saying it's some people, and then I was arrested for burning the Confederate flag. Casting contempt by word or deed upon flags of the Confederacy was against the law at the time. And it was probably worse than being opposed to the war of Vietnam, for sure.
Do that now.
And so that was a burden I carried for a while. And still, we're proudly as the oldest living, at least white prisoner of war from the Confederacy, because I was never tried. My bond was never returned. And I'm wanting reparations here. I'm going to get my $200 back someday.
Good luck.
Yeah, something like that. I get back. And the work that we did then exemplified the way that the anti-racist work that we were doing started meshing with the anti-imperialist work that we were doing. Because, wow, look at that. People of color were trying to kill and take their stuff. Look, we got our own people of color trying to kill and take their stuff. And so that was something that I think younger people like myself that got involved in the tail of the civil rights movement for draft age were coming into a situation where our analysis of the problem was global. Modjeska had that analysis when I met her. That was something that she learned from W.E.B. Du Bois a long time before I met her. The globalization problem. They were against the Niagara movement and Du Bois and the rally that Ms. Simkins hosted in '46 here with them. It was a Pan-African movement. It was against colonialism, and that whole line of thought and that line of organizing, which is pretty well erased by the 50s, and that they disparaged and red-baited people and then held out opportunities, the upwardly mobile opportunities for the black people that would work with the white people that they considered to be safe. And that was pretty much the way we had it in South Carolina. The first really radical legislators I knew of were Joe Neal and Joel Cobb Hunter in 92. And I happened to have met and knew Julian Bond, who the legislature in Georgia, he won a seat in the legislature. And the legislature wouldn't see him because he was opposed to war in Vietnam. And Charles Morgan, that guy that was defending the Fort Jackson 8, defended Julian Bond. And that North Carolina had left-leaning legislators in the late 60s. So that there's just this burden of that deeply seated racism that this state was founded on, that white supremacist notion that has been cultivated and inculcated into the culture of South Carolina for the benefit of people making money, that still holds us down.
I'm just reminded of the two brothers. I'm reminded of the two brothers in Tennessee that got put. I mean, again, the parallel is so similar.
Well, if you don't remember history, it doesn't seem like it's repeating itself. And so it all seems new and disorganized. But I want to move on with what happened in regards to the anti-war activities and the authorities' reaction. Show that strike poster, Dr. Green. This poster, I may have printed this one. I printed some posters at the UFO House. They had a collective on Park Street right down there. And this was, I think this was, I don't think they went to trial yet. The place was closed down when they helped. But that's a silk screen about having a strike because there are cops in the Russell House, strike because they invaded Cambodia, strike because your classes are obscene in the face of death, strike against 6 years for dissent. I was wrong, 6 years. Strike against Ford's witch hunt, the prosecutor, strike against dorm hours, strike against darts on campus, strike against ROTC, strike against John Doe warrants, strike against profession, strike. So we just had all kinds of reasons to be striking. A lot of reasons. And we printed these things on paper and we pasted them up all over the campus, all over the campus. Some of them just said strike on it. And those went up overnight on one day that the student government body had voted to go out on strike. More than 380 universities around the state, around the country, voted to go out on strike because of the Cambodian invasion. And that's when Kent State happened on the 4th, Jackson happened a couple days later, and the university arrest started after the hammer came down. That the group that I was the co-chair of, by then I was banned from campus by a court order. I was arrested in March. I was arrested at the airport when Nixon came to town before this for trespassing on public property. And Charles Morgan, the guy that defended Muhammad Ali and Julian Bond and Dr. Levy, was our attorney, and I didn't even know who he was. He was a great guy, very helpful. He won a state Supreme Court case saying you can't arrest somebody for trespassing on public property unless they're breaking a law. And so I had been charged when Nixon came to town to visit Jimmy Burns when he was 90 years old. I had been charged with felonious assault to police officer for 20 years in jail. I was 20 years old. And so that business about me getting in trouble and going to prison and never getting a real job my grandfather warned me about was true. And when the case was dismissed because the trespassing charge, then the case for me theoretically beating up the officer that blackjacked me was thrown out because I had every right to beat up the officer if he didn't have a right to arrest me. That officer became Sheriff Jimmy Metz, who served a good 25 years as sheriff of Lexington County. And when I was arrested in 2001 or 2, when another president came to town at the same airport for the same charge, both he and I knew that wouldn't work, and it didn't. And I was arrested for trespassing, put in his jail. He came out the next day and apologized for not being there because he said it wouldn't happen if I was there. We did have that charge dismissed months later. And then I got one of those phone calls from the state newspaper wanting my comments on the indictment. And I said, what indictment? And they said, well, you've been indicted by a federal grand jury And I said, for what? And she didn't know, and she read the statute, and we looked it up, and it was for presidential assassinations, kidnaps, and threats. They had made my misdemeanor a federal case, but that's another story we'll tell later. And so I had a lot of trouble. It's one thing to another after another. And then by the time that the draft board, I was arrested with the co-chair of AWARE. The co-chair of AWARE was this really enlightened graduate student sociologist with long hair that we had introduced, the woman that I was keeping company with, had introduced the woman she lived with to Jack Weatherford. And Jack was a left radical, and a woman had left her husband, who was a liberal lawyer, who was the son of a sitting US Senator, Maybank. And she left him because he was a liberal and hooked up with this guy who was a radical who turned out to be a cop. That's the real tragic story on that one. But so my problems were manifest very quickly in 1970. And I had been that case went to trial later that year, and I was convicted of malicious mischief for spray painting hell no we won't go on the draft board wall with an FBI informer and a SLED agent and a couple people that were as clueless as I was, doing a protest at the draft board. And I was the only one that got prison time, and they sentenced me to 1.5 years in the state prison. And again, that's a story we'll pick up another time. But I set that up to say that by the time the May stuff, the May Day stuff was happening at the university, I was literally banned from a section of the city by court order. And I didn't know that they did that in America. And it was like Pendleton and Blossom and Assembly and Green Street. And the day that the trouble happened was a day that we, the AWARE group, had the Russell House reserved for teach-ins. That's what people had been doing. They were doing teach-ins about the war for a long time. And so this day was to do teach-ins at the student union. And the university president was called into the governor's office and said that his career was toast unless the student government withdrew their support for this. And the students went to the Russell House for their teach-in and were told they couldn't do it. Their reservations had been canceled. And so I think 40 of them remained sitting in. And I was banned from campus. And so I am at the edge of the banning zone, which was in the middle of the street of Sumter Street in front of Longstreet Theater. If you know that Sumter dead ends into Longstreet. And I don't know, I had a walkie-talkie and they thought that I was communicating with the people in the Russell House. But I could see down the street past a line of highway patrol cars that went all the way to Pickens Street and all the way back to Assembly Street with double-aught buckshot cases, empty little military issue 12-gauge buckshot cases on the ground with these same hot dogs. That to be a highway patrolman, then it was your height had to be as big and your IQ had to be small. And you see some of the pictures of these folks. Robert, you got pictures of the cops? I don't know, you got pictures of the cops. They're in Becci's book. There's really good pictures in Becci's book. But it was scary. It was scary because these guys had killed people at State College for a whole lot less than we were doing. There they are. And that's the chief of, that's J.P. Strom. Hold that picture, Robert. That's the guy that ran the state law enforcement division for decades. He was R.J. Edgar Hoover. And he was out to root out communists. And a communist was anybody doing anything they didn't like, by the way. And so that day, I'm in front of this Longstreet Theater. The students are in the building, and they were trying to arrest the students. They did arrest the students because they wouldn't leave. And there was a bus in the parking lot. There was a parking lot in front of Russell House at the time. But they got the students on the bus, but they couldn't get the bus out because our supporters have surrounded the bus. And so here comes the National Guard. And when the National Guard came on campus, there were like 3,000 students cheering them and maybe 500 of us protesting. That was when they saw me and Pete Strom. Oh, that's the picture. Pete Strom and his little gaggle. That's the guy on the left is Ron Cook. I met him first as a sergeant in the military police at Fort Jackson, running me off the base. And he became a sled agent. He became my personal sled agent, where I could look out the window and there was Ron Cook parked across the street. I could have somebody come in from the Village Voice to do interviews and meet people. And the Highway Patrol would come up with the lights flashing and stop us. And Ron Cook would be a car behind him grinning, leaning up against saying, routine license check, Highway Patrolman says, everyone out of the car. And so we were penetrated. And so Ron Cook was my above ground guy, and this Jack Weatherford guy was my underground guy that I didn't know. And the one on the right is Sonny Clark, who's the head of the narcotics division, who ran a crooked, gay narc squad that is a whole nother book, So Pete Strom walked up to me right before that arrest and thumped me on the chest. Wish I had a video, because it would be the thematic beginning of a movie. He thumped on my chest and he said, boy, you in a heap of trouble. You're under arrest for violating your bond. And they put me in the back of a police car and took me to jail. And I missed all the troubles at the university, which is probably good. I was in there for 3 days. And
where were you, by the way?
In Richland County. And then I got out and I was too busy to mess with them for kidnapping me. And they never even mentioned it. But so that was a really very busy and crazy time where when the guard came on campus and the city police were the biggest irritants of the thing, the city police started beating people. I mean, randomly. By that evening, they started tear gassing dormitories and beating people as they came out. And so the first day, the majority of the students were cheering the cops and the guard. And by day one, the SAE and KA were arguing about how many people they got arrested. So there was a meeting at the Methodist Student Center on Pickens Street that I went to, and I got out, that they were deciding what to do, what the progressive elements could do. And I said, well, we could dress up like cops and beat people and tear gas the dormitories, but we don't need to. Let's just get out of the way. And so they did arrest 40 people, and that there was a occupation of the administration building, and they did some damage. And there were a number of provocateurs involved in that. But the bottom line on those 40 people that were arrested, they said, leave the state and we'll drop the charges. And there they went, 40 Western Brightest left the state. And there has been, as you know, a migration exporting the best and brightest in the state for generations. And there was that one out of the Hamburg massacre, that the New York Times wrote up, not since the time of the pharaohs has there been such an exodus. And thousands of people, Black people, left South Carolina to prepare their lives and for a better life. And so this is the history that we need to know, that there was resistance all during this time. And Dr. Green, I think that we want to do one more thing, and we got 20 minutes for questions. Let's play that the one that says USC chaos. Jane Fonda speaks and the hard hats react.
Okay, sure thing. Go ahead.
Hand away, Jane. This is a random clip. I'm not sure it's out. This is what the television.
There was to be an official parade in this city on Saturday. It has been canceled. There is an alternative. And this is happening all over the country, on military installations, in towns. All of those who are opposed to the war are having a People's Armed Forces Day to oppose the war. We are urging you all to come to the Capitol steps at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning to show your solidarity for the GIs who are protesting the war.
Hard hats protesting the protest.
feel this is nothing but a communist movement, and that's the reason we brought our flag with us. We just want to try to let the rest of the world know that there's Americans left in this country. We got a small group in now. We're hoping this trend will go on and this thing here can be straightened out. Now, we may be too late in our town, but we're hoping that this thing will travel and everybody can get ready. Now, we wasn't ready. We didn't think it could happen in our town. Other people probably feel the same way. But we want the world to know that some Americans left. And they've got to stand up. They've got to quit talking about it. They've got to show themselves. All this talking is getting nothing done. They've got to come out in numbers just like they come out. They're communists. Let's come out and show them America's here. And there's very few there. I know there's probably just 5% of the university. And that part is led by communists. They're the one who's stirring all this up. We're just trying to get the people to know that somebody's going to stand up. And we're trying to get this thing to moving.
Big Tom again, saw the military ready for the peaceful protest. Didn't look all that threatening. Dr. Green, there's one more piece that I think we shan't leave out, and that's number 11, reaction to protest demonstrations by Speaker Solomon Block. It's only 1 minute and 16 seconds long. Solomon Block ran the State House. He was the Speaker of the House for 32 years with his buddy Ed Brown, who was the President of the Senate for another 30 years. And so Mr. Block was the one that, well, Mr. Block speaks for himself. Take it, Saul.
I wish there was some way that I could be president down there for about 60 to 90 days. I throw every one of them off the campus. Now, Tom Jones, as president, is doing a marvelous job. He has some on the faculty that ought to be run off. He has these students that ought to be run off. But he has brought in an outstanding faculty, and he's got some outstanding students, and we must look to the good men on the faculty, to the good men on the in the administration, and to the good men on the board of trustees, and to the good boys and girls who are down there, and measure the worth and value of the university by their conduct, and not by the conduct of 200 or 250 boys and girls who brought disgrace to themselves, to their families, to the university, and to the state of South Carolina.
I think that the vast majority of students at the university are opposed to this form of dissent at the university. Now, by that I mean this, that when you speak to the president of the University of South Carolina and you have dissent, that's fine when you have a list of objectives you want to talk about. But when you start calling him obscene names, and when you start calling other people that are there as guests obscene names, and when you start just taking things in your own hands, I think that's wrong, and I don't care what you say about it.
One of the things that points out, and we keep hearing about protesters that spat on soldiers, and this guy talking about activists being obscene. We were well trained. We weren't obscene. We didn't spit on soldiers. We saw soldiers as victims of this war. And so that may have happened somewhere, but it wasn't us. It wasn't the protesters. And so I want to give Becci a chance to fill the holes that I dug and left empty before we take questions, Dr. Green.
I'm just now getting to the chat, and I'm sorry I've been ignoring people in there. I have nothing to add. I'd rather hear some questions from some folks.
Okay. Dr. Green, is that question?
All right. Randall's had his hand up for a while, so go ahead.
The fire is out. If we transposed all of this official state arrest and prosecution into this era, this time, I would imagine the ACLU individual lawyers would be filing civil suits all over the place for what happened to those involved with the UFO. Was there any civil action to oppose the state actions?
Not to my knowledge. I think that the settlement of dropping the charges and them leaving the state put a nail in it. And there was a time, that was back then at a time when there was so much going on that a civil case the lawyers were busy defending criminal cases, and civil cases seem to be almost frivolous at the point. But you're right, you're right, coulda, shoulda. Another question.
There's a question in the chat from Annette. She asked, who were the guys in hard hats with the flag attached?
Those are people standing on the sidewalk on Main Street in Columbia during this very small demonstration that Jane Fonda had called for at the State House. I think it was a morning type thing in lieu of the military parade that they canceled. And so they were local rednecks. I don't know any of them or that any of them had any particular fame other than having a camera stuck in their face by a local TV reporter.
Okay, any other questions?
I have a comment.
Go.
I have a comment. I was raised in Iowa.
Lord have mercy.
You had a good life. I was raised in Iowa, and during the time I graduated from high school in 1971, and during the time of Vietnam in the late 60s, if you got in trouble with the police, you had a choice of going to jail or going to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So that's what a lot of them, that's the choice they got, going to jail or going to Vietnam. So yeah, the black ones. Huh? No, we're talking about people under 21 and stuff, you know.
Women didn't have to go to Vietnam.
No, women didn't have to.
That's what I'm saying.
It was the men, yeah, it was the men. If you got in trouble.
Your age too.
Okay, if you got in trouble, you went to Vietnam. So you had your choice of going to Vietnam or taking your chances in jail, so.
Yeah, that reminds me, I wanted to talk about one of the lessons learned by the government from Vietnam. And the primary lesson was don't draft white middle class kids. And because they were the ones filling the streets. And so what happened was the all volunteer army. And it is analogous to what we started doing. Don't send your troops into your third world country. Get a puppet and let it be their war and let their mercenary army fight it. And so basically we turned the draft into an economic draft that bumped the percentage of black people in the military, black and Hispanic people, poor people, low income people, up to like 30%. And it was a mercenary army that probably is not very effective, but that concept of not drafting people that are going to turn out in large numbers in protest because they have inherent privilege. They shopped it out. They shopped out the war stuff. And we're doing the same thing, say, in the wars that we're involved in now. We have a military presence in nearly 140 countries around the world, but most of the place where there's active aggression going on, we're rapidly trying to job that stuff out. Any more questions?
So Annette has a follow-up, and I'll go ahead and answer this one. She asked one more question: were the guys in the hard hats to mimic the laborers, construction workers versus protesters, similar to the riots under Nixon, in which Nixon applauded the construction workers? Yes. So what Annette's referring to is the hard hat riot in 1970 that occurred that same year. And you start having copycat groups across the country saying that, in essence, the silent majority that Nixon spoke of was becoming less silent and was becoming louder in their opposition, the opposition in the war in Vietnam.
Well, if there's any good news, we were more organized than the hard hat contingent. But I don't know that there was any direct relationship with that organized effort with the construction thing. But if there are any more questions, Robert, at some point I got some housekeeping stuff, but we take more questions if there are some.
Fred, I just wanted you to repeat the organization or the site you mentioned after the Zen project. There was another one you mentioned.
Teaching for Change. Well, Robert, hearing no more questions, I do want to point out to people that we're closing in on the end of the school and that we do have graduation planned for July 1. It's a Saturday. And we're starting at 4 o'clock, and we're inviting and encouraging people that have been Zoomers, some of whom we've never even seen your face, to make the trip. Make the trip to Columbia and join us for the graduation in person. We will Zoom it for those that can't make the trip. And those that come will be gratified by getting to meet real human beings instead of virtual human beings and share some social time and dinner with us. That's July 1.